when people in the West think of their ancestors, they tend to think of the recent dead, the ones who are remembered because you interacted with them or because they're remembered by name or by recent history, or they're thinking of just individuals. And what's important is that a lot of traditional frameworks for ancestor reverence think of the ancestors also as lineages or groups of ancestors, and as not just the recent ones, but also those who lived before remembered names.
Hmm.
And so even if you know that your ancestors acted in very harmful ways, or you don't know anything about them, and so there's a quality of cutoff or of disappointment or even trauma that is associated with your experience of your recent people. What's important is to not let that recent strata of your ancestry fully define the bigger topic of ancestry. Because to do that is to project your experience of your parents or of the last few generations onto thousands of years of history.
Hmm.
And so even a colonizer, a settler, upper middle class European ancestored people who have related very poorly with people of color still have older ancestors who lived before those kinds of troubles began in Europe and then got exported to the rest of the world. And it's possible for European ancestor people to connect with those much older ancestors in a way that's culturally healing and empowering
Hmm.
as well.
It's really hard, I think, from my perspective, to even imagine what it would look like to have lived back then, and how our people interacted.
Real generally speaking, indigenous, tribal, animistic folks who live in relatively smaller communities, at least compared to modern cities, uh, by necessity are more in tune with the different rhythms and movements of the natural world or the other than human world, and tend to have a more relational and respectful way of viewing the rest of the of life. And that framework of ancestor reverence and reverence for the other than human worlds was broken down in our European lineages from the period of maybe 200 current era until 800, 1000 current era, with the expansion of Roman Empire and then Christian, the Holy Roman Empire. And so there was a lot of internalized, internal trauma in Europe, a lot of white on white crime, as it were, and that trauma then gets exported in the last 500, 600 years in the form of genocidal behavior toward native peoples and African peoples, and um, well, so then we have our current cultural mess that we're in,
Hmm.
and it's important to be able to track that trauma story back to a time where in Europe people were no longer living in relationship with the rest of life and so there's a conceptual disconnect from the realm of spirit, from dialogue with the rest of the natural world.
And that's part of what you see is how we could heal the current mess.
I
Is
do. I see it as
reconnecting.
one important part of it.
Hmm.
And if white people or European ancestor people only go so far as to say, "Wow, ancestrally we've been behaving badly," and then feel like garbage about ourselves and stop there, that's not particularly transformative. There's an invitation to dig deeper and be like, so aside from one's personal trauma, where are the cultural roots of the trauma? Where did it begin? Because the resonance that open-hearted white people might feel with, let's say, Native North American people who are being ongoing, in an ongoing way, related with poorly by the government, by mining companies, whatever it is. And so there's a sense of affinity for like, no, don't mess with indigenous people, and that's great. It's great to be supportive allies in those causes. And what it does is it resonates and lights up our own uh, older ancestral trauma about the times when our Germanic or British Isles or ancestrally Polish or Italian, whatever it is, ancestors got um, related with poorly. And there was a disconnect from tribal sensibilities because of empire within Europe. And so it's true, I do a lot of work of helping people of whatever background to connect with their ancestors in spirit who dwell in the present as allies to then heal up the lineages between those older ancestors in the present. And from that place of being more healed, our ancestors can help us in the decolonizing, cultural healing work of the times, and of course in our personal and family healing work.